Welcome. Tonight we're stepping into the shadowed streets of Harlem to uncover a story most people think they already know, but don't. You've heard the name Bumpy Johnson, often labeled as just another gangster, but the truth is far more complex and surprising. His life blurred the line between crime, power, loyalty, and intellect in ways no other figure of his era ever did. This video is built on carefully cross-checked historical records, court documents, and first-hand accounts that took serious time to research. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss deep, true stories like this one that history rarely tells honestly. From the very beginning, what separated Bumpy Johnson from nearly every other gangster of his era was his mind. Long before his name inspired fear or respect on the streets of Harlem, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson was known among those close to him as someone who thought deeply, spoke carefully, and read obsessively. While most men in his world relied on brute force, quick tempers, and intimidation, Bumpy relied on something far more dangerous: intelligence sharpened by constant self-education. He wasn't just street smart, he was intellectually curious in a way that baffled both allies and enemies. Bumpy grew up in an environment where violence was common and opportunities were scarce. But even as a young man, he showed signs of being different. He questioned authority, challenged ideas, and refused to accept that his place in society had already been decided for him. When he entered prison early in his criminal life, many expected it to break him or harden him into something reckless. Instead, it transformed him into a thinker. Prison became his library. While other inmates gambled, fought, or slept away their sentences, Bumpy spent hours reading books most people around him had never heard of: Shakespeare, Plato, Voltaire, political philosophy, poetry, history. He absorbed ideas about power, justice, loyalty, and human nature, and he applied those ideas to the streets once he was released. This habit alone made him an anomaly. Gangsters of the early 20th century were not expected to quote philosophers or debate moral ideas. Yet Bumpy was known to recite poetry from memory, sometimes in the middle of tense negotiations. He believed words could disarm people just as effectively as weapons. When others shouted, he spoke softly. When others rushed to violence, he paused and calculated. That calm intelligence unsettled people far more than aggression ever could. Law enforcement officers later admitted that Bumpy was one of the few criminals they dealt with who could argue legal theory and social injustice with surprising clarity. His intelligence also shaped how he viewed power. Bumpy understood that fear alone was temporary, but respect, even forced respect, could last. He studied how institutions worked, how politicians moved, how money flowed, and how narratives were controlled. While other gangsters focused only on territory and profit, Bumpy focused on influence. He knew which people mattered, which ones didn't, and which ones could be turned into allies. That strategic thinking allowed him to survive situations that would have destroyed most men in his position. Even his enemies recognized this difference. White mob leaders who dominated New York's underworld often underestimated black gangsters, assuming they lacked discipline or sophistication. Bumpy shattered that illusion. He negotiated on equal footing, understanding contracts, leverage, and timing. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was precise. Many deals associated with his rise were not sealed with violence, but with calculated conversations where Bumpy anticipated outcomes several steps ahead. That level of foresight was rare in a world driven by impulse. His love for literature wasn't just a private habit, it shaped how he saw himself and his role in Harlem. Bumpy didn't view himself as a simple criminal. He believed he was a product of systemic injustice and that his intelligence gave him a responsibility to navigate that system rather than be crushed by it. He often spoke about dignity, legacy, and how history would judge him. This awareness of time and memory made him more careful than most men in his position. He understood that reputations outlived gunshots. There are stories of Bumpy sitting in upscale restaurants, dressed impeccably, reading poetry while surrounded by bodyguards. To outsiders, it seemed absurd, a gangster quoting Shakespeare. But to those who knew him, it made perfect sense. Bumpy believed knowledge was armor. It protected him from being predictable. It made him unreadable. And in a violent world, unpredictability was survival. Even during moments of rage or betrayal, Bumpy rarely lost control completely. He analyzed why people acted against him, what pressures they faced, and whether retaliation was worth the consequences. Many times, he chose restraint where others would have chosen bloodshed. That restraint wasn't mercy, it was strategy, guided by intellect rather than emotion. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's intelligence didn't make him innocent, but it made him exceptional. He wasn't just a man reacting to circumstances. He was a man interpreting them, reshaping them, and bending them to his advantage. His mind allowed him to stand apart in a brutal era, commanding respect not only because he was feared, but because he was understood to be dangerous in a way most men weren't: thoughtful, informed, and always several moves ahead. That is why, even today, historians and street legends alike agree on one thing: Bumpy Johnson wasn't just different from other gangsters, he was operating on an entirely different level. What truly separated Bumpy Johnson from most gangsters wasn't just how he thought, but who he thought about. While many criminals saw their neighborhoods as nothing more than territory to exploit, Bumpy saw Harlem as his home, his people, and his responsibility. That sense of obligation shaped a personal code of respect that made him both feared and protected by the community he operated in. He understood something many others never did: power without community support is fragile, but power rooted in respect can endure for decades. Bumpy came of age at a time when Harlem was more than a place. It was a symbol. It represented black culture, ambition, resistance, and survival in a country that consistently denied black people dignity and opportunity. He saw firsthand how white-owned businesses, corrupt politicians, and outside gangs profited from Harlem while its residents remained poor, over-policed, and unheard. That reality deeply influenced how he carried himself. Unlike other gangsters who preyed on their own neighborhoods, Bumpy was careful about who he targeted and how far he went. He believed that harming ordinary black residents was not just bad business, but a violation of honor. There are countless stories of Bumpy stepping in when local families were being exploited. If a landlord unfairly raised rent, if a business owner was being extorted by outside operators, or if someone was being harassed without cause, Bumpy often intervened, not always out of kindness, but out of principle. He believed Harlem should not be weak in its own streets. This earned him a reputation that went beyond fear. People might not have approved of his criminal life, but many trusted him more than the police or the courts, which routinely failed them. That trust didn't come easily. Bumpy enforced strict rules among those who worked under him. Stealing from locals, disrespecting elders, or harming women and children was not tolerated. Those who broke those rules didn't last long in his organization. To outsiders, this might sound like selective morality, but in the world Bumpy lived in, it was a defining line. He understood that chaos within the community would turn Harlem against him, and once that happened, survival would be impossible. Respect was not a public relations tool for him, it was a survival strategy grounded in identity. Even the way he carried himself reflected this code. Bumpy was known for dressing sharply, speaking with dignity, and demanding respect not through shouting, but through presence. He believed representation mattered. In a society that portrayed black men as uneducated, violent, and disposable, Bumpy intentionally projected intelligence and self-control. He wanted Harlem to see a man who refused to be reduced to a stereotype, even while operating outside the law. That image resonated deeply with residents who were tired of being dismissed and humiliated by the world beyond their streets. Perhaps the most telling example of this respect was how Bumpy handled conflict. Violence was part of his world, but he avoided it when innocent people could be caught in the crossfire. Shootouts in crowded areas, reckless displays of force, and unnecessary bloodshed were things he actively tried to prevent. Not because he was soft, but because he understood the cost. Every stray bullet damaged not just lives, but trust. And once trust was gone, Harlem would no longer protect him. This relationship went both ways. When Bumpy was arrested or imprisoned, Harlem didn't celebrate his downfall. People stayed loyal. Businesses kept quiet. Witnesses disappeared. Information didn't travel. That silence wasn't forced, it was earned. Many residents believed that, flawed as he was, Bumpy was still one of their own, navigating a rigged system the only way he believed possible. In contrast, other gangsters who exploited their communities found themselves isolated, betrayed, and eventually destroyed. Even his rivals recognized this difference. Competing gang leaders often struggled to gain influence in Harlem because they lacked local support. They relied on fear alone, and fear without respect is unstable. Bumpy, on the other hand, could walk the streets openly, talk to shop owners, greet elders, and move without constant paranoia. Harlem wasn't just where he operated, it was where he belonged. This sense of responsibility didn't make him a hero, and he never claimed to be one. He understood the contradictions of his life. But he believed that if he had to exist in the underworld, he would do so without turning his back on his people. That belief shaped every major decision he made. It influenced who he protected, who he punished, and how he was remembered long after his death. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's respect for Harlem's black community was the foundation of his power. It's why he lasted longer than most, why his name still carries weight, and why his story continues to spark debate. He wasn't different because he broke the law. Many men did that. He was different because he never broke his bond with the people who shared his struggle. And in a world built to strip black men of identity and dignity, that loyalty made him something rare. A gangster who understood that respect, not fear, was the strongest currency of all. What truly set Bumpy Johnson apart was his understanding that violence was a tool of last resort, not a first response. In an era where most gangsters built reputations by how quickly they pulled a trigger, Bumpy built his by how effectively he talked people down, talked them into deals, or talked them out of making fatal mistakes. He believed violence drew attention, created enemies, and shortened lifespans. Negotiation, on the other hand, created leverage, stability, and longevity. That mindset alone made him an exception in a world addicted to bloodshed. Bumpy understood human nature better than most men around him. He knew that behind every threat was fear, behind every betrayal was pressure, and behind every rival was someone who wanted something. Instead of meeting aggression with aggression, he asked questions. What does this person really want? Who are they answering to? What do they stand to lose? That approach allowed him to diffuse situations before they exploded. Many conflicts that could have ended in shootings were quietly settled over conversations, meals, or carefully timed meetings arranged by Bumpy himself. This didn't mean he was weak. Quite the opposite. Negotiation only works when the other side knows violence is still an option. Bumpy's reputation ensured that people understood the stakes. He didn't need to demonstrate brutality often because everyone knew he was capable of it. That balance, calm negotiation backed by credible threat, made his word carry weight. When Bumpy said a deal was final, it usually was. People knew breaking it would bring consequences, even if those consequences didn't come immediately. His dealings with white mob leaders are a perfect example. At a time when black gangsters were expected to submit or be crushed, Bumpy refused to play that role. Instead of challenging them through open warfare, which he knew Harlem couldn't survive, he negotiated. He studied their structure, learned who actually held power, and positioned himself as indispensable. He offered stability in Harlem, protection of shared interests, and a guarantee that business would run smoothly as long as he was respected. That approach forced men who would never publicly treat him as an equal to privately negotiate with him as one. These negotiations weren't emotional. Bumpy removed ego from the equation. While other gangsters took insults personally, he saw them as noise. What mattered was outcome. If swallowing pride for the moment secured long-term control, he did it without hesitation. That emotional discipline saved his life more than once. In meetings where tempers flared and guns were visible, Bumpy stayed composed. That calm unnerved people. It signaled confidence, not fear. In criminal circles, nothing is more intimidating than someone who doesn't react the way you expect. Within Harlem, this approach also prevented chaos. Turf disputes, internal power struggles, and rival operations were often resolved through mediation rather than shootouts. Bumpy acted less like a warlord and more like a strategist. He understood that violence in crowded neighborhoods didn't just kill targets, it traumatized communities and invited police crackdowns. Negotiation kept business running quietly, which was always his priority. The less noise, the more control. Even law enforcement noticed this difference. Officers later admitted that when Bumpy was in control, crime was more organized and predictable. That predictability made him harder to eliminate. Unlike reckless criminals who left trails of bodies, Bumpy left few obvious reasons to be aggressively targeted. Negotiation allowed him to operate in the gray spaces, not clean enough to praise, but not chaotic enough to destroy. Another reason negotiation worked for him was timing. Bumpy was patient. He didn't rush decisions. If a deal wasn't right, he waited. If tensions were high, he let them cool. Time was a weapon he used expertly. Rivals often made mistakes out of impatience, mistakes Bumpy was ready to capitalize on. By the time violence became unavoidable, he had already positioned himself so the outcome favored him. This strategic patience extended to betrayals. Where others would retaliate immediately, Bumpy often delayed. He wanted to understand why the betrayal happened and whether it could be turned to his advantage. Sometimes, instead of punishment, he offered forgiveness, not out of mercy, but because it created loyalty rooted in debt. People who expected death and received a second chance often became fiercely loyal. That loyalty strengthened his network and reduced the need for constant enforcement through fear. Of course, when negotiation failed, Bumpy did not hesitate. Violence, when it came, was decisive and final. But because it was rare, it carried more impact. People understood that if Bumpy crossed that line, it meant all other options were exhausted. That reputation made negotiation even more effective because no one wanted to be the one who pushed him there. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's reliance on negotiation over violence wasn't about morality, it was about intelligence. He understood that survival in his world depended on restraint, calculation, and control. Guns could win battles, but words could win decades. That's why he outlasted so many others, why his power endured, and why history remembers him not just as a gangster, but as a strategist who mastered the art of influence in a world ruled by force. Bumpy Johnson's relationship with law enforcement and politicians was one of the most unusual and misunderstood aspects of his life, and it's another reason he stood apart from other gangsters of his time. While most criminals saw the police and politicians strictly as enemies to evade or fight, Bumpy viewed them as part of the same system he had to navigate. He didn't believe in total opposition or blind cooperation. Instead, he treated power as something to be managed, studied, and, when possible, quietly influenced. From early on, Bumpy understood that the law was not neutral. It protected certain people while punishing others, often along racial and economic lines. As a black man operating in New York during an openly discriminatory era, he knew the system was stacked against him no matter how carefully he behaved. That knowledge shaped his approach. Rather than acting recklessly and inviting constant police attention, he learned how law enforcement worked from the inside. He paid attention to which officers were ambitious, which were corrupt, which were ideologically rigid, and which simply wanted to get through their shifts without trouble. That awareness gave him an advantage few criminals possessed. Unlike many gangsters who relied on crude bribes or intimidation, Bumpy was selective and strategic. He didn't try to buy everyone. He understood that overreaching created exposure. Instead, he focused on information. Knowing when raids were coming, when political pressure was increasing, or when a particular officer was trying to make a name for himself allowed Bumpy to adjust his operations quietly. Sometimes that meant scaling back activity. Other times it meant letting a minor arrest happen to protect something larger. He accepted short-term losses to avoid long-term destruction. His relationship with politicians was even more complex. Harlem, despite its cultural importance, was often treated as a political bargaining chip rather than a priority. Politicians showed up during election seasons, made promises, and disappeared. Bumpy watched this pattern closely. He understood that politicians valued stability and votes more than morality. As long as Harlem didn't erupt into chaos, many were willing to look the other way. Bumpy positioned himself as a stabilizing force. Crime under his control was quieter, more predictable, and less disruptive to public order than the alternatives. That made him useful, even if unofficially. This dynamic created an unspoken understanding. Bumpy didn't publicly align himself with politicians, and they didn't publicly acknowledge him. But behind the scenes, lines of communication existed. Messages were passed through intermediaries. Warnings were delivered indirectly. Boundaries were quietly set. This wasn't corruption in the dramatic sense people imagine. It was coexistence. Each side understood the other's limits. When those limits were respected, things remained calm. When they weren't, consequences followed. Law enforcement officers who dealt with Bumpy often described him as frustratingly composed. He didn't rant about injustice during arrests, nor did he beg for leniency. He treated interactions with police as transactions, measured, polite, and deliberate. That demeanor confused officers who expected either fear or aggression. Bumpy offered neither. He understood his rights, kept his words minimal, and allowed his lawyers to do their work. This professionalism reduced unnecessary escalation and made him harder to demonize in court. At the same time, Bumpy never fooled himself into believing the system would ever truly protect him. He knew that alliances with police or politicians were temporary and conditional. He didn't trust them. He managed them. When political winds shifted or public pressure increased, he prepared for crackdowns. He expected betrayal, which meant he was rarely caught off guard by it. That realism kept him alive in moments when others were destroyed by misplaced trust. His time in prison further sharpened this understanding. Bumpy observed how laws were enforced unevenly, how sentences varied based on race and connections, and how public narratives were shaped. He paid attention to which crimes attracted headlines and which didn't. When he returned to the streets, he adjusted his behavior accordingly. He avoided actions that would provoke public outrage or political embarrassment, knowing those were the moments when law enforcement would be forced to act decisively. This balancing act didn't make him untouchable, but it made him resilient. Bumpy went to prison multiple times, yet he always returned to influence. Unlike many gangsters who were eliminated through police pressure or political shifts, Bumpy survived because he understood the ecosystem he lived in. He didn't see the law as a single enemy to defeat, but as a moving structure that could be anticipated and navigated. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's relationship with law enforcement and politicians wasn't about corruption or cooperation alone. It was about awareness. He understood power on every level, from the streets to City Hall. That understanding allowed him to survive in a world designed to crush men like him. While others fought the system head-on and were destroyed, Bumpy moved through its cracks, adapting, enduring, and remaining a presence long after many of his rivals were gone. That ability to coexist without submitting to authority is one of the clearest reasons he was unlike any other gangster of his era. One of the most defining reasons Bumpy Johnson stood apart from other gangsters was the way he challenged and survived white mob dominance in New York without triggering a war he couldn't win. At a time when the criminal underworld was overwhelmingly controlled by Italian and Irish syndicates, black gangsters were expected to operate on the margins, take orders, or be eliminated. Bumpy refused all three options. What made this remarkable wasn't just his defiance, but how intelligently he carried it out. He didn't confront white mob power head-on with brute force. He outmaneuvered it. Bumpy understood the reality of the racial hierarchy in organized crime. White mob bosses had political protection, legal advantages, and public invisibility that black operators did not. A direct challenge would have been suicide. So, instead of attacking the structure, Bumpy studied it. He learned how the syndicates made money, how they maintained order, and most importantly, where they were vulnerable. He recognized that even the most powerful organizations depended on local control, and Harlem was not just territory, it was a world with its own rules, loyalties, and rhythms that outsiders never fully understood. Rather than allowing white mobs to exploit Harlem directly, Bumpy positioned himself as the gatekeeper. If they wanted business to run smoothly there, it had to go through him. This was a radical shift. He didn't ask for equality, he created necessity. His control of the streets, combined with his deep support from the community, meant that bypassing him would lead to instability, violence, and unwanted attention. White mob leaders might have looked down on him socially, but they couldn't ignore him strategically. That forced them into negotiations they never wanted to admit were happening. What truly unsettled his rivals was that Bumpy was not reckless. They were used to dismissing black gangsters as impulsive or disorganized. Bumpy shattered that stereotype. He kept his operations disciplined. He limited unnecessary violence. He ensured money flowed predictably. This professionalism made him more reliable than many white-run operations, which were often plagued by internal power struggles. Over time, some syndicate leaders realized that working with Bumpy was safer than fighting him, even if it bruised their egos. His relationship with powerful white figures was never submissive, but it was never openly hostile either. Bumpy chose his moments carefully. When pushed too far, he resisted just enough to remind them he was not disposable. When compromise served him better, he accepted it without resentment. This emotional control was critical. Many men before him had died because they confused pride with power. Bumpy understood that survival itself was a form of resistance in a system designed to erase him. Another key factor was his understanding of image. White mob bosses often relied on invisibility, blending into society, appearing respectable, and operating behind closed doors. Bumpy flipped that dynamic. He became a visible presence in Harlem, respected and protected by the people. That visibility was a shield. Any attempt to remove him risked destabilizing an entire neighborhood. In an era when authorities already feared unrest in black communities, this made him untouchable in ways his enemies didn't expect. There were moments when violence did erupt, but even then, Bumpy avoided full-scale war. He knew that open conflict with white mobs would invite massive retaliation and police crackdowns. Instead, he used pressure points, disrupting operations, withholding cooperation, or leveraging alliances. These moves sent clear messages without escalating into chaos. It was a chess game, not a street fight, and Bumpy played it with patience. What made his challenge truly historic was that he never sought to replace white mob dominance with chaos. He sought autonomy. He wanted Harlem controlled by someone who understood it, protected it, and benefited from it without destroying it. That goal put him at odds with an entire criminal power structure built on racial exclusion. And yet, he endured. Not because the system accepted him as an equal, but because it could not function efficiently without him. Even decades later, historians note how rare this was. Most black gang leaders of the era were either absorbed into white, controlled systems or violently removed. Bumpy remained independent. He negotiated from a position of strength that came not from numbers or firepower alone, but from intelligence, restraint, and legitimacy within his community. That legitimacy was something no outside syndicate could manufacture. In the end, Bumpy Johnson didn't just survive white mob dominance, he exposed its limits. He proved that power wasn't only about race, money, or violence. It was about understanding people, controlling territory through trust as much as fear, and knowing when to resist and when to adapt. That ability to exist and thrive in a system stacked against him is why his name still stands apart. He wasn't just a gangster operating under white mob rule. He was a man who quietly, persistently, and intelligently forced that rule to make room for him. What ultimately set Bumpy Johnson apart, even in the eyes of his enemies, was not just what he did, but how he carried himself in a world where brutality was the norm. Many gangsters were feared, some were respected, but very few were genuinely acknowledged by their rivals as being different. With Bumpy, that acknowledgement came reluctantly, quietly, and often after years of conflict. His enemies didn't praise him publicly, but in private conversations, court records, and later testimonies, a consistent theme appears: Bumpy Johnson was not like the others. One reason for this was his discipline. In an underworld filled with impulsive men driven by ego, anger, and insecurity, Bumpy displayed a level of self-control that unsettled people. He didn't lash out over insults. He didn't make emotional decisions in the heat of the moment. Even when provoked, he was known to pause, think, and respond later in a calculated way. To men who survived by intimidation and unpredictability, this calmness was deeply uncomfortable. It made him harder to manipulate and harder to trap. His enemies also noticed that Bumpy didn't crave chaos. Many gangsters thrived on constant conflict because it reinforced their image and kept others afraid. Bumpy understood that chaos attracted attention, and attention brought destruction. He preferred stability, even if that meant sacrificing short-term gains. Rivals found it difficult to provoke him into open war because he refused to play by emotional rules. That refusal alone earned a grudging respect. A man who could say no to violence in a violent world was dangerous in a different way. Another factor was his intelligence. This wasn't street smarts alone. Bumpy was widely known to read extensively, write poetry, and discuss philosophy. His enemies noticed this, even if they mocked it publicly. In private, it made them wary. They understood that a man who thinks deeply is a man who plans deeply. Bumpy didn't just react to threats. He anticipated them. Rival gangsters often realized too late that he had already prepared for scenarios they thought were spontaneous. That foresight made him feel almost untouchable at times. Even those who hated him admitted he was fair in his own way. If Bumpy made an agreement, he honored it. If someone crossed a line, the response was measured and proportional. There was no randomness in his retaliation. This predictability created a strange form of trust, even among enemies. They knew where they stood with him. In contrast, many gang leaders were erratic, punishing allies and enemies alike based on mood or paranoia. Bumpy's consistency made him more reliable, which in the criminal world is a rare and valuable trait. His treatment of people beneath him also stood out. Enemies observed that his followers were loyal in a way that went beyond fear. That loyalty worried rival leaders more than any weapon. It meant Bumpy's power didn't collapse when pressure increased. Arrests, intimidation, and bribes often failed because his people believed in him, not just his authority. Enemies recognized that kind of loyalty couldn't be bought or forced easily. It had to be earned, and that made it dangerous. There was also the matter of dignity. Even when facing arrest, prison, or public scrutiny, Bumpy maintained a sense of personal pride without arrogance. He didn't beg, boast, or perform for attention. This quiet dignity frustrated opponents who wanted to break him psychologically. They expected desperation or rage. Instead, they got composure. Over time, this eroded their sense of victory. Defeating a man physically is one thing, defeating him mentally is another. With Bumpy, that mental defeat rarely happened. White mob figures, in particular, struggled with how to categorize him. They were accustomed to viewing black gangsters as either disposable muscle or minor players. Bumpy fit neither category. He negotiated as an equal, spoke with confidence, and refused to accept humiliation. Even those who held racist views were forced to confront his competence. That confrontation didn't change their beliefs, but it did change their calculations. They began to treat him differently, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. Perhaps the strongest acknowledgement came from survival itself. Many of Bumpy's enemies rose quickly and fell violently. They were killed, imprisoned, or forgotten. Bumpy endured. Decade after decade, he remained relevant. That longevity forced even his harshest critics to admit that he possessed something rare. Survival in organized crime is not luck alone. It requires judgment, restraint, adaptability, and an understanding of human nature. Bumpy demonstrated all of these repeatedly. In the end, his enemies didn't call him different because he was kind or moral by conventional standards. They called him different because he didn't self-destruct. He didn't burn everything around him to prove a point. He didn't let pride override reason. He understood power as something to maintain, not display. That understanding placed him in a category few ever reached. So when people say even Bumpy Johnson's enemies acknowledged he was unlike any other gangster, they're talking about this combination of intelligence, discipline, dignity, and endurance. In a world where most men flamed out quickly, Bumpy moved steadily forward. And that steady presence, calm, calculated, and unbroken, is what made even his rivals stop, watch carefully, and quietly admit that they were dealing with someone rare.